And so the century would come to its conclusion, and it would be a troubled conclusion. It would be marked by debates over science, over politics, over religion. It would be dominated by a man who had absolutely no political power whatsoever and yet had a tremendous influence. It would be racked by one of the greatest scandals to uh, encompass all of France and then later the world. It would be marked by the two leaders of two of the great nations of Europe, Germany and Russia. The man you see in the upper right is a young Charles Darwin, who started out wanting to become a minister. He went to the seminary, but then he decided to turn away from the ministry and embark on a career in science. He made his famous trip in 1830 on the HMS Beagle, and from that he came up with that most dangerous of theories. It was perhaps the most dangerous of all theories ever promulgated in human history. The scientific revolution now reached its climax in Charles Darwin, who published his book on the origin of species in 1859. This is after he made his voyage on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. Darwin introduced the scientific theory that populations evolve over the course of generations through a process called natural selection. His book presented a body of evidence that the diversity of life on Earth arose by common descent through a branching pattern of evolution. Meanwhile, in an Austrian monastery, a monk by the name of Gregor Mendel began experimenting with pea plants. He began noticing patterns in the breeding of the peas in reference to their height, pod shape, and color, seed shape and color, and flower position and color, and formulated the theory of heredity and the terms dominant and recessive. He said that there is some sort of invisible factor deep within the makeup of these pea pods that determines the various aspects of this plant. We now, of course, call it the gene, but he had not quite gotten to that point yet. His work essentially went ignored for almost 40 years until it was rediscovered by 3 German scientists, who then took Mendel's work and postulated the gene theory. But along with evolution, natural selection, came numerous misconceptions, usually by people whose religious or world views were threatened by the advent of such new knowledge, and theories by people looking to exploit this new knowledge to fit their own political agendas. Case in point, social Darwinism. Why not take natural selection and apply it to the model of business? This was used to justify ideas about the superiority of white, middle-class males, why unrestricted capitalism was the best way for business to be conducted. Some scientists concluded that women were passive and lacked sexual feelings, which of course is patently false, but at the time it was considered to be a valid theory. On the left is the much elder Charles Darwin, and on the right is the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel, who gave us the theory of heredity. Here you see an example of one of the bigger misconceptions regarding the theory of evolution and natural selection. The belief that human beings descended from monkeys and apes, or as they would say in some places in the deep south, humans didn't come from no monkeys or no apes. That's not what the theory is. The theory does hold, however, that humans and apes descended from a common ancestor. At one time, we had the same ancestor, but the apes went their way and we went our way. We came out of the trees and we began to shed our hair and develop voices and so forth, and began to manipulate our environment rather than just simply live off of the environment. That is what the theory of evolution is, and it is of course still to this day debated in many political forum, which is not really where it should be debated. Nonetheless, it continues to be. And I am not here to advocate one side or another, although as an academic, I must say that the theory of evolution holds pretty firm with those like myself. The French Revolution had really thrown a great deal of chaos into the social order, and many people were looking for ways to put that social order back together to bring in harmony. And one of the ways in which this was pursued was through the philosophy known as positivism. Positivism holds that all genuine knowledge is either positive, that is, a posteriori, and exclusively derived from the experience of natural phenomena and their properties and relations, or they are true by definition. Thus, information that we derive from our sensory experience, as interpreted through reason and logic, is the exclusive source of all certain knowledge. Therefore, careful study of the facts would generate accurate or positive laws of society. And Isidore Marie Auguste Francois Xavier Comte, or just Auguste Comte, formulated the doctrine of positivism to remedy the social disorder caused by the revolution. He tried to solve problems caused by economic and social change using the sciences. It is Auguste Comte who gives us the social sciences. What Comte envisioned was what he called a religion of humanity, a secularized religion that would inspire altruism, order, and progress, or as one writer called it, Catholicism minus the Christianity. This belief had actually more influence at the time than either Marx or Darwin had. Now, the man who was dubbed the most influential English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, was a disciple of Bentham, and he was a critic of the religion of humanity. He said Comte is a little too cut and dry, a little too sanitized. There's not a whole lot of emotion in this. John Stuart Mill conceived of liberty as justifying the freedom of the individual, in opposition to unlimited state and social control. His two great books are On Liberty in 1859, and then The Subjugation of Women, 1869. He becomes one of the first advocates of gender equality. That makes him really a radical. On the other side, there's Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is the creator of the phrase survival of the fittest. He published Social Statistics in 1851. It is he who begins to try and apply the business model, or it's Darwinism to the business model, I should say. And so this leads to unrestricted capitalism. It also leads to a great deal of white racism. Oh my, I'm talking about critical race theory. Everybody be upset and worried. But that's what Herbert Spencer does. And this is where it all began. From left to right, there is Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, and the very hirsute Herbert Spencer. Now, there were people who dominated the sciences, politics, the arts, and various other aspects of the 19th century. But when it came to society and fashion, no one commanded more attention than the man you see in the photo right here. Known as Bertie, he was His Royal Highness Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Victoria and the second child of the family. He is the second longest serving Prince of Wales after Prince Charles passed him in 2018. Bertie is quite a character. He led a very leisurely lifestyle. He was often a nuisance to his parents, but in many ways his parents inculcated that in him. His affair with an Irish-born actress produced something of a scandal, and his father Albert, while very ill, had to travel to Ireland to end the affair and basically set his son straight. And it was really a rather poignant moment where Albert, who had been treating Bertie very much like a, a drill sergeant would treat an infantryman, finally realized that his son was simply rebelling against him. And he saw the error of his ways and wanted to kind of rework the relationship at that point. But Albert died 2 weeks after he visited his son, and Victoria blamed Bertie to the day she died. As a result of this, Victoria kept him out of politics and she kept him out of the military because of her downright contempt she had for her son. She regarded him with distaste. She said he was frivolous, indiscreet, and irresponsible. She wrote to her eldest daughter, Victoria, I never can or shall look at him without a shudder. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, however, had a warm personal relationship with her younger brother. So what happened with Bertie? He is the heir apparent to the throne. He is the Prince of Wales. He became a world ambassador. Whenever an opera hall opened or an important event took place, Bertie was always there. He was very good-natured. He had a common touch with both noble and with the common man. He could win over even the most hostile crowds with his fine speeches and every man's touch. One time he arrived in Paris when anti-English sentiment was high. He got off the train to booze. He went to the opera. He visited the various places in Paris, said all the right things. And by the time he left, the French were like, Bertie, Bertie, please, no go, no go. He pioneered numerous fashions and often frequented the cover of magazines. This is a forerunner of how the British royals are looked to for fashion today. Bertie was also noted for his mistresses. He married Princess Alexandra, the daughter of the King of Denmark. Now, he is socially liberal, although he was a political conservative. He's the first to openly say that using the N-word was offensive to him. He defended the Japanese against his nephew, the Kaiser, who called them a bunch of little yellow monkeys. Bertie, on the other hand, said, other than looking different than us, they are as intelligent and they are as brave as anybody I've ever met. On the other hand, he was against home rule for Ireland and wanted more women's rights, but he didn't want women's equality or suffrage. He was later very politically astute, even though he had been kept out of politics. He kept his eye on things. He was very close with Prime Minister Gladstone, in many ways just to piss off his mother, who was very close with Disraeli. His mother would not send him anything original as far as state documents. Gladstone would smuggle them to the prince. So he kept abreast of what was going on. It is this political acumen that would help engineer what was later called the Triple Entente, the alliance between Britain, France, and Russia prior to the First World War. Bertie was also a very heavy smoker. He smoked 20 cigarettes a day and 12 cigars a day. He started that habit very early, and as a result of this, it would kill him and shorten his life by quite a bit. At a young age, the prince was a fashion trendsetter. The sales of boys' sailors' uniforms went up exponentially after this picture of the prince appeared in a magazine. Here is the young Prince of Wales around age 14. He is wearing the uniform of the Prince of Wales. He's also showing the blue sash, which means that he is already now a member of the Order of the Garter. And you will see Prince William wearing this at many state functions today. The prince made a trip to the United States at age 16, and there he was wildly greeted with admiration, went everywhere, spoke to everyone, asked great questions, showed that he was attentive, and of course, he was a good fashion model and took several pictures for fashion magazines. The prince married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. They produced 5 children and had a pretty solid marriage, but Bertie enjoyed mistresses throughout his married life. He socialized with actresses Lily Longtree, Sarah Bernhardt, and Jenny Jerome, who was the mother of Winston Churchill, singer Hortense Schneider, aristocrats like Daisy Grenville, the Countess of Warwick, and Lady Susan Vane Tempest. A prostitute named Giulia Benani, known as La Barucci, was frequently a guest of the prince. He also hung out with wealthy humanitarian Agnes Kaiser, and a lady named Alice Keppel also served as a mistress. And her great-granddaughter is Camilla Parker Bowles, currently married to the monarch of England, Charles III. Now here is Bertie as he was getting older and getting a little bit fatter. Bertie graced the covers of Vanity Fair on several occasions. Once when he was young as the Prince of Wales, and then later as King Edward in his naval uniform. Bertie was possessed of incredible confidence and had a great sense of himself. He had no problem posing for the cameras, and there, of course, is one of his 12 cigars per day sticking out of his mouth. Here is Bertie, the Prince of Wales, with his 2 sons. The older son, Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, is on your left. He died early at the age of 28 from influenza during a pandemic. His younger son, George, the future Duke of York, Prince of Wales, and then later King George V, stands on the right. Many people theorize that Albert Victor, who went by the nickname Eddie, was Jack the Ripper, but he was actually out of the country when those murders were committed. There is Bertie standing on the far right, and his mother Victoria is sitting in the center. He's posing here with his Russian relations. On the left is Tsar Nicholas standing, and his wife, Empress Alexandra, and baby Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna. Now, here you see one of the women reported to be one of Bertie's mistresses. Her name is Jenny Jerome. She's an American. She's an actress. Well, whatever their relationship may or may not have been, she later married a member of the British nobility. She married Lord Randolph Churchill, the third son of the Duke of Marlborough. They would have a son. They would name him Winston. He would achieve some success later on in British politics. Let us go back across the English Channel now to France. You will recall that France had been defeated in 1871, bringing an end to the Second Empire and the rule of Napoleon III. France was humiliated in this war. They had been imposed a huge indemnity, that is a fine that they had to pay Germany. They lost the eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. With the fall of Napoleon III, many in France wanted to see a return to the monarchy. They wanted a king, just like England would have. And so what they decided was this: they would have a return of the Bourbon monarchy. They would choose the Comte de Chambord, who was the grandson of the last Bourbon king, Charles X. And they would then choose the Comte de Paris, who was the grandson of the last king of France, Louis Philippe, to be his heir apparent. And this would unite the House of Orleans and the House of Bourbon once and for all, and you would have this great French monarchy restored. One problem: the Comte de Chambord was about as mule-headed as his grandfather was, and it was easy to understand why it was that his grandfather had been overthrown back in 1830. They came to him to become king, and he says, fine, we're going to change the flag from the French tricolor back to the white with the fleur-de-lis on it. And the French said, no way. And so the Comte de Chambord said, then I won't become king. And Pope Pius IX said, all of this over a napkin. So what they did is they created a republic. They said, all right, here's the deal. Chambord will die. He has no heirs. He has no children of his own. And then when he dies, the Comte de Paris can become the king, and we'll let him be the king of France from that point onward. Problem is that by 1883, many in France said, you know what? This republic seems fine with us. Let's make it permanent. And so the republic was made permanent, and it endured despite numerous hardships. There was an attempted military coup. There was scandal. And at the same time, France had some great success after this humiliation. They paid off their indemnity rather early. They acquired an empire. They took over Vietnam full time as they made it a part of their colonial empire once and for all. They strengthened their hold in North Africa. France was on the rebound. On the left is Prince Henri, the Count of Chambord and the Duke of Bordeaux. Like I said, he was the grandson of the last Bourbon king, Charles X. He would have been named King Henri VI if he had just accepted the French tricolor. He was as stubborn as his grandfather was. On the right is Prince Philippe of Orleans, the Count of Paris. He's in the uniform you see there of the Union Army of the United States of America. He served there during the American Civil War along with his younger brother. He would have succeeded the childless Chambord had the Duke accepted that rule and accepted those conditions. One of the reasons why the French enjoyed the Third Republic so much at first is that it was weak, it was ineffective. And that actually is good because it kept out of the way of French affairs. But it also left the government open to scandals and plots by both wings of the monarchist camp, the Bourbonists and the Orleanists, as well as the anarchists who were up to no good during this particular time. There was a huge economic scandal surrounding the digging of the Panama Canal. And with this, France had to relinquish its rights to dig the Panama Canal and turned it over to the United States. Secretary of State John Hay, who had been Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary, was now the Secretary of State. And through what was called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, the United States took over the digging of the canal in Central America. But the most serious threat to the French Third Republic was the Dreyfus Affair of 1894. That would carry on all the way almost to the turn of the century. Captain Alfred Dreyfus was a French intelligence officer who was born in Alsace and was Jewish in heritage. Now remember, Alsace had been lost to the Germans in 1870, and that was a thorn in the side of the French. The issue was that military secrets regarding a specific type of artillery piece were being leaked from French intelligence to the German High Command. A very poor investigation settled on Dreyfus, who was then convicted and sentenced to life in prison for espionage and treason. The only evidence against him is that he was the only Jew on the intelligence staff. Obviously, it has to be the Jew who was the treasonous bastard. So, Dreyfus was convicted, drummed out of the military, sent to Devil's Island, the French penal colony off the coast of Guyana in South America. Dreyfus's family maintained his innocence and clamored hard for another investigation. And so, to mollify the family, a counter-investigation was launched by a cavalry officer in counter-espionage named Georges Picquart. And in this investigation, the evidence arose that Dreyfus was innocent. Instead, it was a Hungarian-born officer named Ferdinand Esterhazy that was giving away secrets to the Germans to pay off his copious debts. What then happened after this became a matter of national shame for France and shone a light on the dark underbelly of the French Third Republic. What happened is very reminiscent today of the big lie that is being perpetrated in political circles and in social media. You know, the big lie, of course, is about the election supposedly being stolen. Back to Dreyfus, though. The army considered it a matter of honor and would not admit its mistake. Their officers considered themselves something apart from the Third Republic. Protectors of the Third Republic, they didn't really like the Third Republic. While the politicians of the Third Republic tried to bend over backwards at all times for the army to get their acceptance. So what do? They transferred Picquart to North Africa for a time, hoping that he would die out there. They suppressed the evidence, held a military court, and acquitted Esterhazy after only 2 days, with sham testimony. The head of military intelligence after Picquart, Major Henri, was discovered later to have forged documents to convict Dreyfus. Henri was arrested and then committed suicide mysteriously in prison. At this point, Émile Zola, an influential writer and journalist, many people considered him to be a pornographer because he wrote about many adult subjects. He wrote an article titled J'accuse, in which he charged the French government with malfeasance and anti-Semitism. Zola published a letter on the front page of the newspaper L'Aurora and caused an uproar in France and abroad. Zola was prosecuted for libel against the French government and found guilty in 1898, so he fled to England. But the Dreyfus affair split the nation in two and threatened yet another French Revolution. It became the subject spoken about by the drunk uncle at dinner parties. Newspaper writer and later Premier of France, Georges Clemenceau, at first thought Dreyfus was guilty, but then shifted course when the evidence arose. An American by the name of Theodore Roosevelt decided to weigh in while he was police chief in New York and said that Dreyfus was beyond a doubt guilty. In the end, Dreyfus was reconvicted, but then accepted a pardon because he was too tired and broken by Devil's Island at that point. A court then gave everyone amnesty, including the ones that had forged the evidence and were still alive. No one was happy with this decision. Everyone was pissed. It would take nearly a decade for Dreyfus to be officially exonerated and then returned to the army. The Dreyfus affair actually strengthened the Third Republic because it showed the callousness and the pig-headedness of the army, as well as the monarchist factions within France. Nationalism in France took a hit in favor of Republican patriotism. For the Jews of France, who had to endure the anger of those supposedly adhering to the spirit of liberté, égalité, and fraternity, the ugly issue of anti-Semitism raised its head. Anti-Semitism was now unleashed in France, and if anti-Semitism could be so virulent in France, then Jews throughout Europe felt safe nowhere. And thus, many Jews became inspired to embrace Zionism, that is, the return of Jews to the Holy Land in Palestine to have a nation of their own. On the left is Captain Alfred Dreyfus. When he was finally restored to the Army, he retired as a major in 1906. But then he came back to duty during the First World War and participated in the defense of Paris in 1914. He was manning the exact type of gun that Esterhazy, who you see on the right, was selling secrets to the Germans about. By the way, Esterhazy's secrets were bogus. He wasn't actually giving them any actionable intelligence. On the left is a pro-Dreyfus newspaper, Lxviii, with its headline, J'accuse, which was addressed directly to the President of the Republic. On the right is an anti-Dreyfus and anti-Semitic circular called La Libre Parole. And there you get to see the ugly side of anti-Semitism as it depicts the Jew as a sinister, big-nosed, bearded, big-eared, almost apish creature. Very, very disgusting. Here is a political cartoon called The Family Dinner, in which the patriarch says, and above all else, we shall not speak of the affair. And in the next frame of the cartoon, you see that the dinner is broken down because they decided to speak of it. And the best part about this that I love in this picture is the dog in the lower right that has a fork sticking out of its rear end. Perhaps the most humorous incident in the entire tragedy of the Dreyfus affair circulated around the president of France, Félix Francois Faure. He was the one to whom Zola penned his article J'accuse, in which he accused the French government of anti-Semitism and a miscarriage of justice. Now, President Faure had worked on a Franco-Russian alliance and helped bring stability to the Republic. Well, in the midst of the whole Dreyfus affair, Faure died in his office, and it was later discovered that he died from a heart attack that he had while having sexual relations with his mistress in his office. When that was discovered, people poured out into the streets by the thousands to salute his casket. Even Bertie attended the funeral at Notre Dame de Paris. To the east of France was Imperial Germany, which was now at the height of its power following the Franco-Prussian War. Germany was now under the military hegemony of Prussia. The capital city was now Berlin. In the south, you see the very important city of Munich, which is located in Bavaria. You will recall the region of Silesia, taken from Austria in the War of the Austrian Succession. Also want your attention drawn to the great Baltic port city of Danzig, which is now the Polish city of Gdansk. Also, you should note the region of Schleswig-Holstein that was taken from Denmark. It is now part of Denmark today. And finally, the region of Alsace and Lorraine that was taken from the French in the Franco-Prussian War. This is the growing German Empire. Germany was now united, but not under trade or republican values, but under the blood and iron of a highly militarized Prussian state. Wilhelm I, Old Willie, had been declared Kaiser, which is German for Caesar, or the Emperor of Germany, but he ruled under the guiding hand of Bismarck. Meanwhile, his son Friedrich, nicknamed Fritz, was the crown prince. He had married Princess Victoria, the oldest daughter of the Queen. Together, Fritz and Victoria, Fritz and Vicky as they were called, prepared to liberalize Germany under a more British style of rule. There was one problem, though. Old Willie continued to remain as emperor well into his 80s. The year 1888 was the year of the three Kaisers. Wilhelm died in March at the age of 91. The 56-year-old Fritz now came to the throne, but he was dying of cancer of the throat by that point. He died 99 days later in June of that year, and that left the throne to his 29-year-old son, Wilhelm II, whom people referred to as Willie. Wilhelm II was the oldest grandson of Queen Victoria and the nephew of Bertie. The two men did not like each other at all. Wilhelm had a traumatic breech birth, and this left his left arm withered and useless, and this may have affected his emotional growth. He did not have a good relationship with his mother. He was intelligent, but he had a terrible temper and an impetuous nature, which led him at times to put his foot in his mouth by making some outrageous statements at times. It was he who coined the term yellow peril in reference to the Chinese. He also referred to his own people, the Germans, as the Huns when threatening to send soldiers to China. This was something later that the British and French would seize on to during both World Wars. He did not like British liberalism. He preferred Prussian autocracy. He began to strut in a Prussian manner instead of like a more liberalized Brit. The issues confronting Wilhelm on his accession to the throne were significant. Even though Germany had emerged as a major power in Europe, it was between a resurgent France and the growing power of Russia. He rejected Bismarck's desire for peace and also rejected the attitude of the Iron Chancellor toward workers in Germany. So when it came to foreign policy, he was very strident and very conservative. But when it came to social policy at home, he was actually quite liberal. Furthermore, Germany was late to the race for empire. The Kaiser wanted Germany to get into the race for empire. He called it wanting a place in the sun for Germany. As a result of all this, he fired Bismarck and began what is known as the New Course. The New Course meant that he wanted to challenge Britain on the high seas. He wanted to build a huge blue water navy. He wanted to reform and improve German education. He wanted to improve the study of medicine. He wanted to compete with the Germans. The Kaiser's chief problem was his personality. Wilhelm probably had a roaring case of ADHD, which made him appear restless and never able to finish one project before going to another. He was the son of a British mother, and so he admired the British while at the same time he hated Britain, and he hated his own mother, because he was never quite accepted as one of them. He especially resented his uncle Bertie, because Bertie treated him as a nephew rather than as an emperor. Willie was a man tortured by his insecurities and presented the appearance of a bully at times. This would get him into trouble more than once. Here is Crown Prince Friedrich III with young Wilhelm. You'll notice that they are dressed in Scottish Highland attire. That is because they are at Balmoral Castle in Scotland for the wedding of Bertie. When he was not with his parents, Willie was assigned to Prince Alfred, the second son of Queen Victoria. Those two didn't get along well at all, and he would often bite and scratch and kick his uncle to get away from him. That is Kaiser Wilhelm on the left in an official portrait. You'll notice that he shields his left arm from the photo. He does that quite a bit in his photos because his left arm was withered and about 6 inches shorter than his right arm. You also notice the upswept mustache. That is the Prussian style of mustache, something like the Bieber haircut today. On the right is a cartoon of Wilhelm jettisoning Bismarck, the captain of the German ship. Even though Russia was a growing power, their Tsar, Nicholas II, was first cousins with Kaiser Wilhelm, Willie and Nicky, and they wrote each other letters quite a bit and had a little bit of an affection for each other. Nicholas II was the son of Tsar Alexander III. Now, Alexander III believed that he would rule for a long, long time. Instead, he died early at the age of 49, and so his 26-year-old son, Nicholas II, would become the last Tsar of Russia. Not only was he first cousin to Wilhelm, but he was also cousin to Prince George, the son of Bertie. He married his own cousin, which that's what happened back then, Alexandra, known as Princess Alix. She was a German princess and a granddaughter of Victoria. She went by the name Alexandra Feodorovna, which was the nomenclature for the Russians. She also carried the hemophilia gene to her son, Alexei. She became more and more unpopular with the Russian people for a series of reasons that we'll get into a little bit later. Nicholas, for his part, was badly underprepared for his role as Tsar. His father did not prepare him for the position. And so when Alexander died at 49, Nicholas suddenly inherits the throne, and Nicholas, up to this point, had not really done much in the way of political education. His chief pastime was to work on a scrapbook. As a bad omen, the public picnic that accompanied Nicholas's coronation turned into a tragedy when word got out that the food and drink was going to run out and not be enough for everyone. So the crowd rushed to get their share, and individuals were tripped and trampled upon, suffocating in the dirt of the field in which the picnic was happening. Of the approximate 100,000 in attendance, it's estimated that about 1,400 individuals died and another 1,300 were injured. Nicholas was a believer in autocratic rule. That's the only rule he had ever known. He was not interested in liberal reforms, and yet he would slowly but surely give way to some limited reforms. As I said already, his son Alexei, his only son, inherited the hemophiliac gene from his mother, and this would lead to a series of misfortunes for the royal family that would eventually result in their undoing. That is the official painting of Tsar Nicholas on the left and his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna, on the right. This is a picture of Tsar Nicholas and King George V, Bertie's son. They are first cousins. You'll notice the remarkable similarity of the two rulers. Actually, if you shaved off their beards, the differences would be rather apparent. But nonetheless, people remarked on that. This is the empire that Nicholas II inherited on his accession to the throne of all the Russias. The majority of the Russian population, however, lives in the western part of Russia, not in the eastern part of Russia, which is where Siberia is.